water loop.
Technology is a powerful tool for improving water management. Who's got more technology than NASA? I'm here at their Ames Research Center in Silicon Valley to learn about the use of satellite data to improve water management by measuring evapotranspiration. Very excited to talk to them about this and then head out to some farms to learn how they're using this tool. Here at NASA, I'm speaking with Forrest Melton, a senior research scientist.
So evapotranspiration is the transfer of water in the form of water vapor from the land surface to the atmosphere. It's the combination of evaporation from the land surface plus transpiration from plants. It's invisible. We forget it's happening, but it's happening all around us all the time. And after precipitation, it's usually the largest hydrologic flux. So it's really important if we want to understand how water supply and water demand are changing over time and how things like droughts are impacting vegetation and evaporative water stress in vegetation across the landscape. And that's important for things like wildfire events and improving our ability to predict, anticipate, and respond to wild and fire events. And evapotranspiration is interesting because Landsat is gives us the longest, most continuous data record of Earth observations that we've got, going all the way, starting with Landsat 5 all the way back to 1984, with a pretty consistent set of measurements flown in space. And we can get these continuous measurements, not just in the multispectral wavelengths that help us track vegetation condition, rates of deforestation, changes across the landscape in terms of land cover and land type, but we can also measure evapotranspiration. So those thermal infrared measurements give us the ability to quantify evapotranspiration at spatial scales as fine as 1/4 of an acre across the landscape.
So what's the origin of this OpenET, this tool? You have all this data, all this satellite power. You have a big need to improve water management, to improve irrigation, to be more precise, more efficient, especially in Western U.S. What's kind of the origin story then of OpenET?
So OpenET builds on a couple decades of research supported by NASA, USGS, USDA, and others to develop the capabilities to map evapotranspiration with satellite data. So this has been evolving now for a number of decades. Starting about 7 or 8 years ago, we brought the science community that had been working on these problems together to see if we could begin working towards a fully automated solution that would provide data over long time periods with low latency to help make the information available to solve some really important challenges when it comes to water resources management.
How does it work then? How does this tool work, especially from the user perspective? What's powering it, and then what do they see on their end? How do they then use that to improve what they're doing with water?
Sure. Maybe I'll start by saying a little bit just about how it works.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
It's an invisible gas. It's really hard to measure on the landscape, like on the land surface. It changes rapidly from field to field. As you go from a meadow to a forested area, you see these rapid shifts in evapotranspiration rate. So how do we do it from space, right? If you've run through a sprinkler on a hot summer day, you understand the basic principles of remote sensing of evapotranspiration, right? You come out of the sprinkler, water evaporates from your skin, and that cools your skin. The process of evaporation consumes energy. And that same process is happening across the landscape all the time, all around us. And so we have higher rates of evapotranspiration. We have more evaporative cooling, and the land surface, we can actually see it from space in the thermal infrared wavelengths. The land surface will look cooler. Where we have lower rates of evapotranspiration, we have less of that cooling effect, and it's going to appear warmer. And so when you look at a satellite image of land surface temperature, those patterns pop out clear as day. What we then do is we use these physically based models that consume the satellite data, combine it with weather information and some other information about what's happening on the landscape, and we can compute evapotranspiration using these physically based models. The spatial scale is between 30 to 100 meters, depending on the inputs and the satellite products used. but that allows us to then produce these maps and information products on evapotranspiration at daily, monthly, and annual timescales. So all the data that NASA collects is freely and publicly available. For OpenET, from the beginning, we recognized how important it was for water users, so farmers, ranchers, conservation groups, and water managers to have access to the same information at the same time. And being able to use that as a shared basis for decision making was really important to the project. That meant that it had to be as easy to access as checking your bank account or watching a movie on Netflix. So something that was unique about the project at the time was how closely we worked not only with our partners, with farmers, ranchers, local, state, tribal, and federal water resource managers, but also with the commercial sector to ensure that we were designing user-driven information systems that were super easy to access and use, and that would be responsive, fast, and reproducible.
Next, I spoke to Robyn Grimm of the Environmental Defense Fund about OpenET, the various ways it can be used, how it actually works when people open the platform, and the ways that OpenET is being used in California. And a lot of times these agriculture folks or water folks are being asked to really, they're accountable for how much water they're using, or have to report on that. And so there needs to be some mechanism to actually help them do that, not just water effectively, but be able to say, hey, here's what's happening with water, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of different applications, right? So that application you're speaking to is sort of easing the regulatory burden of complying with, reporting requirements, reporting to the state, reporting maybe to the federal government in some cases, but most likely to the state. But there's also the fact that, growers are looking to match what they apply to their crops to what the actual demand is from those crops, right? And that's something that ET can tell you, is how much water are the crops actually using week to week, right? And so there's some irrigation scheduling applications for this data as well. There's also kind of advanced planning and looking ahead, right? So if we're thinking about setting conservation targets for water use, for example, we know what we're dealing with. We know drought and scarcity are becoming more frequent. If you think about the Colorado Basin, for example, there are well quantified data sets on, how much less water is going to be available for agriculture and other purposes in that basin. So then you set targets, but how do you know sort of how different approaches to conservation are likely to work? Well, if you have a data set that can look at what happens after certain approaches are implemented in terms of the actual water savings that are accomplished, that's really helpful, right? And then you can sort of insert that into planning tools to forecast out, okay, if I try approach X, this is the water savings that I'm likely to achieve. And then you can also look back and say, did it happen, right? So for sort of that basin scale or district scale planning around water conservation and learning about the approaches that work for the least cost, right? Those are all really important questions for society to be able to adapt to this sort of changing reality of water availability. And OpenET is absolutely essential for that type of planning and implementation of those kinds of programs.
Could you talk about just generally what it's like when you open OpenET, when you go on this platform, and what people see in there, and kind of just generally how they actually use it?
Yeah, well, one thing I'd like to say about that is I give so much credit to, this was a project that was funded by a mix of sources, some philanthropic, some federal agency funding. We also got some funding from some local water interests like the South Central and North Delta water agencies. And all of those folks recognize the importance of a user interface and a user experience that is intuitive and actually pleasant, right? And I think so many times when data sets are created or databases are created, they're not easy to access, they're not intuitive. And so one of the things we were able to do with OpenET was actually work with a private web development firm that specializes in user-driven design, right? And so when you go onto the OpenET platform, it's actually quite pretty. The maps are really aesthetically pleasing. They're easy to understand. There's actually a lot of metadata, so there's a lot of information about the models themselves, how the ET models work, and how the data is calculated, what their strengths and weaknesses may be. There's information about case studies, so I always like to point that out as well, because I think people tend to go straight to the data explorer and want to explore the data. But there's a lot of additional information and really helpful sort of educational and contextualizing information on the website. So I encourage people to look at that. But a lot of people want to go straight to the data, and when you do, you can click on this button that says explore the data, and you get this really beautiful map. Right now focusing on the US. I think there's eventual goals of expanding outside of the United States. And the data is a chloropleth map, so it's colored by sort of rates of ET. So greater rates of ET show up and it's a different color than lower rates of ET. And you can view the data in terms of it being summarized by a polygon set, so like a field boundary data set. I also think there's plans of adding things like watershed boundaries or counties or things like that. Right now, the field boundary data set is available, or you can just look at the data as it appears sort of in raw pixel form, right? So those 30 by 30 meter squares that are available via the satellite imagery. And I think that's called the raster view. And you can drill into very high level resolution where you're looking at individual fields, right, or individual pixels. Folks can draw their own polygon if they want and get the time series data for that polygon. You can click on the already available shapefile that's been preloaded onto the database. And what's available is data from the last 5 years at a monthly time step. If you go in and draw your own polygon, I believe you can also see daily data. And, it's showing you what's happening in terms of how much water is evaporating and transpiring from that particular shape that you're looking at over the last 5 years, which is really incredible.
Powerful tool. I just can't get over the 30 by 30 meter resolution, right? I mean, they're from a satellite in space. They're telling us about evapotranspiration in that small piece of land. Incredible.
Yeah. I mean, within California itself, there's been experiments with utilizing this data. As I mentioned before, there's irrigation scheduling applications. And so there's been some experimentation with wine grapes in some parts of the states of using this data as part of an irrigation scheduling platform. And again, kind of better matching the amount of water applied to what's actually being utilized, taken up and utilized by the crop. So that's one example here, and I know that that's happening in other parts of the country as well. Another example in California is, I'm sure you've done interviews with folks on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. That's another really important application is thinking about management at that groundwater basin scale and accounting for groundwater use over time. So the groundwater sustainability agencies in California, they're going through this process, right, of setting targets for their basins, setting targets for reductions in groundwater pumping and groundwater use to create a situation in which usage is sustainable over time. And a lot of them are looking into ways of setting up, accounting platforms and methodologies for tracking and understanding use over time, setting allocations for individual landowners or parcels, and being able to understand whether or not water use for that parcel is underneath the allocation that's been set. And so OpenET is being used and tested in a few of those different groundwater accounting platforms by groundwater sustainability agencies across the state. So those are a few examples in California. And one of the questions they have is, when a certain change in approach or certain land use occurs, what can we expect in terms of the difference in water use that's likely to happen into the future? And so, you can take data from OpenET, again, look at what happened in the past when those similar changes happened, and kind of map out an understanding of what's likely to occur given furtherance of those types of conservation approaches and practices across the landscape.
I had the opportunity to travel around California's Delta and speak to a few farmers about their water information needs and the role of OpenET. First, I met with Brett Baker, a sixth-generation farmer in the Delta.
Water use wasn't highly monitored or metered in the Delta until 2009, when our state legislature passed the Delta Reform Act. And that required that all local surface diverters report annually in a supplemental statement of diversion and use their diversion and use of water. And we tried for many years to come up with a scheme that met the legislative requirement and mandate as well as give farmers something that they could use, understand, and be independent in their own reporting on. So for many years, we used an Excel spreadsheet. We got University of Cal Poly and UC Davis studies on evaporative transpiration of crops. We had a way for folks to come up with the consumptive use of their crops on an acreage scale in the Delta. And why we chose consumptive use, we didn't choose consumptive use. Consumptive use, like I said, is the relevant measure in the Delta. For many years, since the 50s and 60s, the state and federal government have been operating projects, export projects in the Delta, and to find and calculate the water availability that was available for export for the Delta, they used a model that modeled consumptive use, because inflows were difficult to measure. There are accretions, there's artesian flow in the Delta, but everyone could agree that the amount of water that was lost in the Delta was that which was evaporatively consumed. There's nowhere for us to stick it. We can't put it in our pocket here. If we don't use it, if the plant doesn't use it, if our crop doesn't use it, we either divert it back into the channel, it percolates into the groundwater, it may accrete back into the channel, or it's lost to evaporative transpiration. And that's the big heavy lift that OpenET's got on its shoulders, is that they're building a benchmark. It's however much water hit the ground or was sucked out of the ground or fell as snow or rainfall, minus what evaporated, minus what was used. And they're trying to figure out what was used part. And I think that's what is no longer available to us. And so I think that's really a great place to start a conversation, because, like we said earlier, you always assume somebody somewhere knows the answers to these questions, but as we sit here today, nobody actually knows how much water was used in the state of California on wild lands and agricultural lands and things like that. So if we're going to try and figure out an overall budget or balance for our water use in the state, this is a great place to start.
After I left Brett's pear farm, I drove to Delta Bluegrass, an operation run by Zuckerman family. I sat down with Ed and his daughter Julia to hear how OpenET has made water management and reporting much easier for them.
So the law stated that we must put monitoring devices or meters on all of our discharge points and report that, or have a alternative compliance reporting system, which is how OpenET came to be, and it's basically the system that we're using now, which looks at consumptive use of the crops.
And we heard from your assistant just how that helped at that hands-on daily work level. But big picture, has that been a game changer for you guys and for any of your colleagues in the agriculture field?
As far as using OpenET,
yeah.
Consumptive use is a broad stroke tool. So I'd have to say that we use other ways to measure our water use and the efficiency with which we use it, more on a micro level, pressure bombing our almond trees and grapes and potatoes, so we make sure that the plant has the optimum amount of water, not too much, not too little. Consumptive use models are broad strokes, and so we're very thankful and happy that we have this alternative compliance method to so we can save a lot of money. I mean, trying to put water meters on 52 siphons, which we have on the diversion points, which we have on this island, would be prohibitively expensive, and they don't work. We actually put meters in, and long term they don't hold up in this kind of water. There's just not a lot of reliability there.
Yeah.
So we're happy that we have the compliance method.
So basically, the state wants to know how much water we're bringing in and using. and there's different siphon numbers that it goes off of, and each siphon feeds water to different types of crops. So before, I had to figure out exactly what crops were going on at each siphon, basically, which changed every year because we rotate crops. So that changed every year. It took me about almost a day to finish one report previously with this just janky looking spreadsheet that was hard to read, hard to use. It was very difficult, and it took me about 1 day to finish one report for one siphon, when now it takes me, with the new OpenET tracker with the satellite-based imaging basically for the maps, takes me 2.5, 3 minutes to fill out everything and
That's
get it done.
incredible. So
Very
from a
much so.
day to 2 minutes. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like how then you use the OpenET and what Delta ACP?
Right.
Yeah, just what that looks like.
So basically, for each siphon, it shows me a parcel of land, and I check and say, make sure, okay, yes, that's the right siphon for this land. And I guess that map comes from, we're talking about NASA. They use satellite imaging from that. It knows what crops are on there because we report that to the state, and that eventually gets reported to whoever it needs to through OpenET.
Are you hearing from others in the agriculture community about their use of these tools? Are they
Yes.
becoming a little more popular?
Oh, definitely. I think last year we had, 100 different farmers from this area meet up at one of the farms and do a whole basically presentation on OpenET and how much easier it's going to be to report our water using from now on. So definitely. And a lot of the guys are actually saying, hey, can you fill this out? Can you do it for me now? Because I get it done so quickly. So I'm having other farms, email me, hey, can you get these in for me? So, which before would have been like, absolutely not. I'm not going to take another 5 days to work on somebody else's reports. Now it's just boom, boom, no biggie.
The uses of OpenET are not just confined to agriculture or California. In fact, earlier this year, there was the first ever gathering users of OpenET. Hundreds of people came together from across the country, from different parts of the water sector, to talk about the tool. Let's hear about that from Robyn Grimm of EDF. I know that you recently there was a gathering of a lot of different stakeholders in OpenET. It seems like there's some great momentum for the tool. Could you just talk about the sense that you got from that meeting?
Yeah, that was such an inspiring and just wonderfully positive thing for me to get to attend and see. It felt like a really big moment for OpenET. We had over 250 attendees there, only 40 of whom represented the OpenET consortium and team ourselves, and everyone else were end users of the platform and of the data. And we put a survey out maybe a year ago asking, hey, if we put an event like this on, would you be interested and would you want to present? And we got folks responding overwhelmingly yes, that they wanted both to be able to share their own stories of their use of the data, but also to learn from one another about how other people are applying the data. And so we had a great series of speakers. I think we had about 40 or more speakers at the event, and it really ranged from producers and growers talking about the use of the data within their own operations to state agency folks, like the Utah use case that I just spoke to, talking about that particular application and how they're using the data. Federal agencies talking about their use of the data for understanding consumptive use at sort of bigger scales, right? Like across something like the Colorado River Basin, for example. So yeah, it was really awesome to see that many people excited about using the tool and already having results to show for it. We launched in 2021, and so here we are. It's 3 years later, and we've already got people showing graphs and pictures of how the data has benefited their planning or their operations, and excited to learn from one another. So it's really neat to sort of see it starting to have a life of its own, and to see the interest within the end user community, and actually interest in folks kind of who work at different scales of water management and from different perspectives.
Now, we're going to go rapid fire with some of the people that attended this users conference to hear about the different ways that OpenET is being used. First is Dwayne Roth, a farmer in Kansas.
in our community, we have a dwindling Ogallala aquifer. In my opinion, on our farm, it would be an unwise management choice not to have something like soil moisture probe or using OpenET to make agronomic decisions. It has quite the tools in the toolbox. What we're looking at OpenET in the future is, for agronomic decisions. And what I mean by that is with OpenET, can we also bring in, say, temperature predictions from NOAA, from other meteorological data sets? Are we going to plant the right crop for the right irrigation well pumping capacity? And if we look at the 30, 60, 90-day temperatures, well, what's the best chance that we have to harvest that crop that we plant? If we pump the water, it's my responsibility, not only to myself, but not only for my nephews and my family, but for the next generations beyond that we don't see. Before, we had never thought we had tools to manage the aquifer. We just thought, here's our crop year. If the crop needs it, we're going to go ahead and pump the water. But now with these other tools that we have, we can actually bring in, again, what is the right agronomic practice? What is the right crop? And we can manage those with ground truthing sensors and also OpenET technology.
Next, we hear from Sarah Larson of the Upper Colorado River Commission about how OpenET is being used to manage water in that basin.
We use OpenET in a bunch of different ways, and one of the most critical things that we're using OpenET for more recently is as a tool to understand how people have been using water over the past 6 or 7 years, so that we can establish a baseline of historical use. And based on their averages of historical consumptive use, we can estimate how much they are contributing to the Colorado River system when they participate in a bunch of different ways. They could forego uses that they've used in the past, and of course this is across all sectors, or they can try something like crop switching to something that is lower water use, or they can try something more like irrigation deficit strategies, or they can try split season fallowing. A whole range of things that OpenET helps to support when we're reviewing applications and determining how people can participate in these water conservation programs. The status that we had before we started using remote sensing was really going to be challenging. All of the upper division states and reclamation use different methods to determine their uses within their states. So when we got together, reviewed the science for a solid decade of work, trying to get to a point where we understood our systems better, and then adopted EE metric as the standard method for irrigation estimation for agriculture in the upper basin on an interstate scale, we really helped to harmonize each other on that page and help to, I think, avert a lot of controversy about how those uses were determined.
Jordan Beamer of the Oregon Water Resources Department also talks about how OpenET is being used in that state.
In Oregon, we are at a critical point of, needing as good a data as we can come up with. Our Water Resources Department is involved in a number of groundwater basin studies where we're investigating areas that have declining groundwater levels and stream flow levels, really wanting to get a really solid understanding of what those numbers are, both at the field scale as well as the basin scale, and OpenET allows us to do that. We also have place-based planning groups in basins across the state. And so in order for them to develop plans and really characterize water resources, both the supply and the demand in those basins, having accurate information around agricultural water demand is really important. In addition, we have a need to accurately quantify kind of the impact of water conservation efforts, because there is a lot of work and effort going towards irrigation efficiency projects and trying to conserve waters as well as possible. The best example that we have is out in the Harney Basin. out in the southeastern Oregon. It's more of a collaborative group, but they are really interested in utilizing OpenET for helping monitor consumptive use from irrigated fields, and they're also pursuing using a conservation reserve enhancement program out in the Harney Basin, and really using OpenET to inform that.
Forest management can be greatly aided by the use of OpenET, as discussed by Yun Yang of the University of Maryland.
I have been working on using evapotranspiration data to study forest for many years. And I think the key finding from my study is that evapotranspiration, other than it's a water quantity that we all care about, and it's also a very effective indicator of forest health and also forest management. I do see there are a lot of potential that unlocked by OpenET, because first it gave us the large coverage, and still it keeps this 30-meter spatial resolution that we can still focus on a small area, look at these variations. The OpenET data that also covers the entire western states, and also expanding to the east of U.S. It really enabled lots of large regional and even continental studies to look at the water budget issue and also the water balances, and also give us a lot of information that we can understand better about the impact of the climate change, and also to help us find solution to build a more sustainable future. For the forest management part, I do think OpenET could be a very useful tool for the forest managers because of the link of ET and forest health, and the current forest management structure. We are always looking for an earlier warning signal for forest health, and I think ET is a earlier signal that we have been looking for.
Lastly, Richard Allen of the University of Idaho summarized why OpenET is so critical for water management right now.
Bring those 6 modeling teams together to where we share as much data as we can in a standardized way, and then present the data to the public in a standardized way and in a centralized way, I think has been a huge, huge benefit, because now a user doesn't have to go to 6 different places to get an estimate of ET, or they don't have to select 1 or 2 places, one model over another, but it's all the models are right there. They can be compared very readily. And then the ensemble, which is an average of all 6 models, is right there also to provide, in many cases, a very robust estimate of ET.
You're in the water loop. Water loop, water loop, water loop.